8:17 on the morning of January 12, 1944, outside the village of Velikiy Bukrin, south of Kiev, the frozen steppe rang with the sound of tank engines choking themselves to death. A column of M4A2 Sherman tanks from the Red Army's 1st Guards Tank Army stood nose to tail along a narrow road cut through white fields and dark birch groves. Frost lay thick on every surface. Breath turned to fog. Metal burned skin at a touch. In the center of the column, one Sherman's engine coughed, shuddered, and died. Another behind it did the same. Then a third. In less than 2 minutes, 5 tanks were silent, their diesel engines locked as if seized by invisible hands. At 8:19, German artillery observers on a wooded ridge to the west began transmitting grid coordinates. By 8:22, the first 75mm shells from a Stu-G3 battery would begin walking toward the immobilized column. And at 8:24, a single mechanic, standing knee-deep in snow with a bucket of boiling oil and no cover, would gamble the lives of an entire brigade on a trick that no regulation manual had ever approved. How did it come to this? The mission itself was simple on paper. The 1st Guards Tank Army had been ordered to break through the German defensive belt guarding the approaches to Bila Tserkva. The objective was to exploit a weak seam between Wehrmacht Panzergrenadier regiments holding scattered villages and forest roads. Speed mattered more than armor. Surprise mattered more than firepower. The M4A2 Sherman diesel had been chosen for the spearhead. Its General Motors 6046 twin diesel engine was reliable by Soviet standards, and its fuel, diesel, was safer and easier to supply in winter than gasoline. But in January, diesel had its own enemy, cold thick enough to turn oil into paste. The column moved before dawn, engines running low and steady to conserve fuel. The temperature at sunrise was -28°C. Snow was dry and deep, squeaking under boots and crunching under tracks. Exhaust pipes grew fringed with ice. The road through Velikiy Bukrin had once been a farm track. Now it was frozen hard, narrow, and hemmed by snowbanks taller than a man. Tanks could not easily turn off it without risking buried tracks. At 7:40, the lead company reported no enemy contact. The Germans were expected farther west, near the ridge lines and villages overlooking the river bend. Everything depended on reaching those positions before the Panzergrenadiers realized what was happening. Then, at 8:11, the first engine began to lose power. The driver felt it through his boots. The Sherman's vibration changed. The deep, even rumble of diesel turned sluggish, uneven, as if thick syrup were being forced through pipes meant for water. He called it in. The commander told him to push through. But at 8:13, the engine stalled completely. The starter motor groaned uselessly. The oil pressure gauge barely twitched. The second tank lost power less than a minute later. The problem was not fuel freezing. The M4A2's diesel fuel, treated with winter additives, still flowed. The real enemy was oil. Engine oil, transmission oil, and final drive lubricant had thickened overnight into something closer to tar. At low idle and slow march speed, the engines never heated enough to thin it. Bearings starved. Crankshafts dragged against their own resistance. By 8:17, 5 tanks were dead on the road, blocking the rest of the column. The man sent forward to fix it was senior technician Alexei Mikhailovich Zorin, age 34, veteran of 2 winters on the Eastern Front and 1 near-fatal engine fire outside Kursk. Zorin had been a tractor mechanic before the war, working on diesel harvest machines in the Volga region. He knew cold. He knew oil. He knew what happened when men trusted machinery more than physics. He also knew fear. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that settled behind the ribs when you understood exactly how many minutes you had before death started walking toward you. When he reached the first disabled Sherman, Zorin did not need instruments. He touched the engine block with a bare finger, just long enough to know. It was cold as stone. Inside it, oil that should have flowed like water moved like fat. He ordered the crew to open the engine hatches. Steam did not rise. That alone told him everything. They tried standard procedures first. Cranking in short bursts. Manual priming of oil lines. Even pouring small amounts of heated water over external oil pipes. Nothing changed. The engines would not turn freely enough to fire. The column commander was already on the radio, arguing with higher command, trying to buy time. Zorin knew time was something they did not have. German observers were not blind. A stationary tank column on a white road was visible for kilometers. The ridge west of Velikiai Bukrin was perfect for artillery spotting. If the Stu-G batteries there received coordinates, they would not need to see the tanks directly. Zorin thought of something he had done once, years before, in a frozen barn with a broken tractor and no heater. He had drained thickened oil, boiled it in a pot, and poured it back into the engine, not to replace it, but to shock the system, to thin what remained, to wake metal that had fallen asleep in ice. No manual approved it. Too risky. Hot oil could warp parts, crack housings, ignite fumes. But regulations were written in warm offices. He ordered men to start heating oil immediately. Not just a little. Buckets full. They used field stoves, burning wood torn from fence posts and doors from an abandoned shed. Engine oil was drained from supply cans and poured into cooking pots meant for soup. Steam began to rise from black liquid. The crews stared at him. One asked what he planned to do. Zorin did not answer. He was counting in his head. Minutes. Shells. Lives. At 8:19, a radio operator intercepted German transmissions. Coordinates were being sent. The words, Bugelisch Ziel gestoppt, moving target stopped, were repeated twice. The Stu-Gs were waking up. Zorin lifted the first bucket of boiling oil with gloved hands that still burned through the leather. He walked toward the dead Sherman as if carrying a bomb. If his trick failed, the engine might seize permanently. If it succeeded, the tank might live. And if he was wrong about the timing, there would be no engine to save at all. Zorin climbed onto the rear deck of the Sherman while shells were still only a thread in the air, not yet a sound on the ground. The engine compartment yawned open like a frozen mouth. Inside, every surface was dull with frost. He ordered the crew to drain what little oil still clung inside the crankcase. What came out was not liquid but slow, black ropes that folded onto themselves like melted tar. The men swore quietly. One crossed himself. The bucket at Zorin's feet trembled with heat. The oil inside it shimmered, thick but alive, releasing a sharp, metallic smell that cut through the cold. He did not pour it directly into the crankcase. That would crack metal. Instead, he used it like a hammer made of heat. First, he poured a narrow stream along the oil lines feeding the main bearings, letting it run over the cold pipes, melting frost, warming steel. Steam rose in pale ghosts. Then he poured more across the outside of the oil pump housing, counting slowly in his head so he would not rush. Only then did he pour part of it into the crankcase itself, not to fill it, but to mix with what remained, hot oil colliding with cold sludge, thinning it by force. The crew watched in silence. The driver sat ready at his controls, hands trembling not from fear but from cold. Zorin closed the hatch halfway. "Short burst," he said. 2 seconds only. The starter motor groaned. The engine turned, not freely, but it moved. Once. Twice. Again Zorin poured more hot oil, this time directly into the sump. Steam hissed and curled out through the gaps. The radio crackled. German artillery had confirmed firing solutions. First shells were being loaded. Again, Zorin ordered. The engine turned faster this time. Still no ignition. Behind them, another disabled Sherman crew shouted that their engine had seized completely. Their bearings were already gone. Zorin ignored it. He had chosen his patient. If this one lived, he could save the others by copying it. He poured the last of the boiling oil into the engine. The bucket was empty. His gloves smoked. "Full crank," he said. The starter screamed. The engine resisted, then suddenly spun as if freed from invisible chains. A second later, one cylinder fired. Then another. The Sherman coughed like a man waking from near death. Thick black smoke burst from the exhaust, followed by a rattling roar that shook snow from the trees. The crew shouted. One laughed like he had lost his mind. Zoran slapped the engine housing, not gently, but with relief. But the danger was only beginning. An engine started cold with thinned oil could destroy itself in minutes if not brought to proper temperature and pressure. Zoran ordered the driver to hold at medium revs, not high, not low, watching the oil pressure gauge as if it were a heartbeat. It climbed. Slowly. Steadily. "Keep it alive," Zoran said. "Do not let it sleep again." Then he ran. He grabbed another bucket of oil already heating by the roadside and sprinted to the second disabled Sherman. Snow sprayed behind his boots. At 8:22, the first German shell landed, not on the road, but in the field beside it, a ranging shot. Earth and snow exploded into the air. The sound arrived after the sight, a rolling thunder that pressed into the chest. The Germans were close. Zoran climbed the second tank as fragments still fell around him. He repeated the process faster now, not because it was safer, but because it had to be. Drain sludge. Pour heat on pipes. Shock the pump housing. Thin the sump. The second engine resisted more. It had been dead longer. Its oil was thicker. When they cranked it, the starter motor began to smoke. "Stop," Zoran said. "We will kill it." Another shell landed closer this time, throwing snow over the road like surf. The column commander shouted over the radio, ordering any mobile tanks to prepare to move and clear space. But they could not abandon the dead ones. Not yet. If they did, the road would remain blocked, and the entire brigade would die behind them. Zoran poured more boiling oil, risking everything on heat. Steam blinded him. His eyelashes crusted with ice and moisture. "Again," he ordered. The starter screamed. Then snapped. The motor died with a sharp crack and a whine. The second tank was now truly dead. Zoran felt it like a blow to the chest. He climbed down, already turning away. He would not waste time on a corpse. At 8:24, German shells began to walk toward the road. One landed behind a column, cutting off retreat. Another hit the trees to the right, showering wood and ice. Zoran reached the third Sherman. Its crew was already half panicked. One man was trying to light a cigarette with shaking hands. Zoran slapped it out of his mouth. "Heat the oil," he said. Now. They had learned from watching the first tank. They were faster. Buckets moved from fire to engine like a relay. The ground shook with every distant explosion. The Stoogie battery was adjusting. Zoran repeated the trick. This time, he poured the oil not just on pipes but along the side of the engine block where oil galleries ran inside the metal. He waited 10 seconds. Crank. The engine turned. Once. Twice. Then caught. It did not roar like the first. It growled, low and angry, but it lived. 2 tanks were now running. "Move the first one forward," Zoran shouted. "Clear the road." The first revived Sherman lurched into motion, tracks biting into frozen snow. It crawled ahead just as a shell exploded where it had stood seconds before, leaving a crater smoking in the white road. The crew stared at the hole, then at Zoran. He was already running to the fourth tank. Shells were closer now. One exploded near the tree line, killing a horse team that had been following the column with supplies. Another hit a field to the left, scattering fragments across the road that rang like hammers on steel hulls. The fourth tank's engine was in worse shape. Its oil pressure gauge had dropped to 0 before it died. Zoran knew that meant bearing damage. He still tried. He poured boiling oil over everything that might carry lubrication. He forced hot oil into the sump. They cranked. The engine turned, but with a grinding sound that made men wince. It fired once. Then died. They tried again. The grinding became louder. "Stop," Zoran said. "It will tear itself apart." The fourth tank was lost. But the road was already clearing. The first and third tanks moved forward, creating space. Other running Shermans behind them began to roll, one by one, threading past wrecked vehicles and shell craters. German shells now landed on the road itself. One struck between the dead second tank and the dying fourth, lifting both slightly and throwing fragments that punched holes in the second tank's side armor. Its crew bailed out, running through smoke and snow. Zoran reached the fifth tank. Its engine was not fully dead, just barely turning. This was his last chance. He poured the last of the heated oil. There would be no more. "Crank," he said. The engine turned sluggishly. Then faster. It fired. Oil pressure climbed. The fifth tank lived. At 8:28, the column began to move again, not cleanly, not perfectly, but moving. Tanks rolled past wrecks and craters, past men who waved them on with numb hands. Zoran stood alone for a moment beside the two dead Shermans, steam rising from shattered metal, shells falling around him like falling trees. He had saved a column with boiling oil. But whether that column would survive what waited ahead was a question no mechanic could answer. The column did not pause to thank him. It could not. Tanks rolled past Zoran with tracks grinding snow and ice into gray paste. Commanders leaned from hatches and pointed forward, urging speed. The road ahead curved toward the low ridges where German guns were hidden. Zoran climbed onto the rear of the last moving Sherman and rode it forward, crouched low, gripping a handhold as shells continued to fall behind them. The Germans were still correcting their fire. The road was already emptying of targets. By 8:33, the surviving Shermans had passed the kill zone. The road behind them was a wreck of craters, shattered trees, and two burned-out M4A2 hulls that still steamed in the cold. Zoran jumped down near a fold in the terrain where the column halted briefly to regroup. Crews poured out, checking engines, tightening bolts, touching metal as if to reassure themselves it was still alive. The tank he had revived first suddenly began to lose oil pressure. The gauge needle trembled, then sank. Zoran ran to it, climbed up, and opened the hatch. Hot oil now flowed too thin. It leaked from seals that had shrunk in the cold and cracked when heated. "Shut down," he ordered. The crew protested. They were in enemy territory. "Shut down or you will die in 5 kilometers, Zoran said. They obeyed. He had traded one danger for another. The hot oil trick saved engines from cold death, but it weakened gaskets, warped housings, and thinned lubrication so much that leaks became inevitable. The tanks could move, but only if they were constantly watched. The brigade pushed forward anyway. They had no choice. The mission was still on. By late morning, the column reached the edge of a forest belt west of Veliky Bukrin. Snow lay thinner under the trees, mixed with dark earth. German panzer grenadiers had prepared positions among fallen logs and shallow trenches. Pack guns waited in clearings, their barrels black against white ground. The first exchange of fire began at 10:02. Shermans fired high-explosive shells into tree lines. German infantry replied with machine guns and Panzerfausts. Stu-G3 assault guns appeared between trunks like gray beasts, firing short, precise shots. One of the revived Shermans took a hit to its turret ring and jammed. Another lost a track to a Pak-40 shot. But the column kept moving. Enough tanks were alive to punch through. Zoran did not fight. He ran between machines, checking oil pressure, listening for grinding, watching for smoke that meant more than battle damage. At 10:27, the fifth tank, the last he had saved, began to seize again. Its engine had overheated and then cooled too fast. Oil thickened unevenly inside it. Zoran had no more heated oil. He used what little warmth remained in the engine, draining part of the oil and cycling the starter in short bursts to keep it moving. A German shell landed close enough to knock him off his feet. Snow filled his mouth. His ears rang. He got up and kept working. The tank survived another 3 kilometers before its engine finally locked forever. Its crew abandoned it under fire, running toward Soviet infantry lines. By noon, the brigade had broken through the German belt. Panzergrenadiers were retreating toward secondary positions. Stu-G batteries pulled back to avoid encirclement. The price was heavy. 4 Shermans burned along the road and forest edge. 2 more lay dead from mechanical failure alone. But without Zoran's hot oil trick, more than half the column would have died frozen and helpless under artillery fire before ever reaching the fight. That night, in a ruined farmhouse used as a command post, reports were written by candlelight. The brigade commander noted in dry language, unexpected engine failures due to extreme cold. Field repair methods enabled partial recovery of vehicles under fire. He did not describe boiling oil. He did not write Zoran's name. Such details were not meant for official pages. But in the personal notebooks of tankers, other words appeared. Driver Viktor Morozov wrote, "Mechanic heated oil in pots and poured it into frozen engines like soup into a dying man. Tank woke up like from the dead. Without him, we would be graves on the road." Loader Pavel Yershov wrote, "I saw steam rise from engine like breath. German shells falling. Mechanic did not look back. He poured heat into steel." Zoran himself wrote nothing. He slept for 12 hours, then woke and returned to work. Within weeks, word spread quietly through maintenance crews. Some tried the trick themselves. Some destroyed engines by pouring too much heat too fast. Others saved machines just long enough to reach repair depots. No official manual ever approved boiling oil as a procedure. After the war, historians found scattered references, diaries, letters, vague reports of thermal shock lubrication. Some said it was myth. Others said it was desperation turned into method. No document could prove exactly how many tanks were saved that morning near Veliky Buchanan. But 2 burned Shermans still lay there for years, rusting in fields where snow once fell thick and silent. And in every account that mentioned frozen engines and sudden steam rising under fire, there was always a shadow of the same story. That once, in January 1944, a man carried boiling oil through falling shells and made dead steel move again. Whether it was genius, madness, or luck remains uncertain. But the tanks moved. And because they moved, men lived. This story is told so that their silence is not. Years later, when the war was already becoming memory instead of noise, men began to argue about that morning. Some said it could not have happened as described. They said boiling oil would crack cast iron, warp bearing seats, destroy seals instantly. They said no engine could survive such treatment and still move under its own power. Others said those men had never stood in -28 degrees with engines already dying, with shells walking closer, with no manuals left to believe in. In 1946, a commission studying winter losses of armored units noted that more vehicles were abandoned to cold than to enemy fire during certain operations of 1943 to 44. The report mentioned improvised thermal methods, without description. No names. No steps. Just the phrase, field solutions not suitable for codification. Zoran returned to civilian life with no medals for that morning. He repaired tractors again. He married late. He spoke little about the war. Once, when a younger mechanic asked him if it was true he had poured boiling oil into a tank engine under shellfire, Zoran answered only, "Steel behaves like men. When it is too cold, it stops living. You must give it warmth, even if it burns." Some veterans insisted that more than 2 tanks were saved that day. Others said only one truly lived long enough to matter. Memory changed with time, shaped by pride, grief, and the need for meaning. What did not change were the scars left on the machines that survived. Depot records show that 2 M4A2 Shermans from the 1st Guards Tank Army arrived weeks later with severe oil system deformation and abnormal seal failure consistent with thermal shock. They were written off and used for spare parts. The trick had not saved them forever. It had only bought them time. But time, on that road near Velikiai Bukrin, was life. In the villages nearby, old men later told children that the ground once burned with black snow, that tanks came alive like beasts from winter sleep, and that shells fell but somehow did not stop them. They did not know about oil viscosity. They did not know about diesel engines or lubrication failure. They only knew that something impossible had happened and that men had walked away from it. Historians still debate the story. Some call it exaggeration. Some say it is technically plausible if done carefully, with gradual application of heat and controlled mixing. Others say the real miracle was not the oil, but the man who decided, in a few seconds, that rules were less important than movement. Because without movement, tanks are only coffins of steel. That morning, a column moved. It moved because a mechanic chose heat over caution. It moved because engines, shocked awake by boiling oil, turned just long enough to escape death on a frozen road. And when they moved, soldiers lived to fight, to retreat, to write, to remember. That is why the story survives, even when documents do not. Because it is not about oil. It is about what men will do when cold, fire, and time close in from every side. And how sometimes, survival comes not from weapons, but from hands that understand metal and fear equally well. For every machine that moved, there were hands that made it move. Remember them.